We are jumping into Antony and Cleopatra, one of my favorite, if not my favorite Shakespeare play. This video, I'm going to help talk about and set up the play a little bit. It needs a little more setup than the previous because there are a lot of moving parts. There's a lot going on here that differentiates it from the other plays. Here are a few notes. On one hand, Antony and Cleopatra can be considered a tragedy. Think of all the tragic things that happen to the characters. It can also be looked at as a history play, specifically a Roman play alongside Coriolanus and Julius Caesar. However, it is also categorized as a problem play in that it presents a moral problem. And even though it is by no means a traditional comedy, there are many moments of brevity and hilarity in the play. In Antony and Cleopatra, the tragic and the comic coexist. Many of our themes continually pop up: indecision, melancholy, guilt. What what most what mostly draws me to Antony and Cleopatra, though, is how languorous it is. I love the languor in the play. There are many moments of pleasurable inaction, of play, of jouissance between Antony and Cleopatra. This is a love play on a different and deeper level than I would even argue Romeo and Juliet. They bicker and protest and profess undying love and devotion. They play, they have fun throughout. Each of Shakespeare's plays has an overarching symbol, a key, a metaphor. Think of Hamlet's wheel. Remember the wheel that kept turning and going toward its tragic end. Think of Macbeth's river of blood. He was too far in after he murdered Duncan, right, to turn back. Here, the dominant theme in Antony and Cleopatra is that of transmutation. That is, the alternating currents of being and becoming, which affect through their manifestations all the psychological and geopolitical operations of the drama, drive the emphasis on figuration, character development, and together produce the play's fortune or denouement. There are a lot of geopolitical moves. There's a lot of political action. And think of how Octavius Caesar, fortune and Antony, the unfortune falls on him. So a few more notes on that. On the overarching themes. The special emphasis on the transmutations of fortune perhaps constitutes the most fundamental and far reaching revision of the play's sources. The becoming theme, this is really fascinating here. The becoming theme is illustrated in the play's post binary exploration of both sex and gender. And we'll look at Cleopatra as, just such an amazing, completely full-blooded character. The Roman values of strict gender division and male dominance are undone by a play that openly jokes about cross-dressing, describes Cleopatra taking Antony's sword while they are in bed, get it, right? And considers a spectrum of desire that includes the fantasies of the eunuch Mardian. In the play's opening speech, the Roman officer Philo laments the unmanly transformation of Antony into an Egyptian playboy, likening Antony's tears to the flux of the Nile since both overflow the measure. Antony's womanizing feminizes him and thereby throws the definition of manhood itself into question. In the eyes of Rome, he has abandoned his imperial duties, allowing himself to be transformed from the triple pillar of the world, right? There's the triumvirate there, into a strumpet's fool, right? That's Cleopatra is the strumpet, Antony's the strumpet's fool. In Rome, Caesar relates the news from Alexandria, quote, "He, Antony, fishes, drinks, and wastes, the lamps of night and revel, is not more manlike than Cleopatra, nor the queen of Ptolemy, more womanly than he." So Antony is feminized here in how he is, the love he feels and how he is far gone with Cleopatra. A few moments I want to look at from my Signet Classic Edition that shed, I think, some important lights on the play. Here's a few notes on Antony here. On Antony's second appearance in the play, he is presented in a scene all the more sharply effective for its contrast with the immediately preceding scene of the fortune telling, which is slow, sleepy, and casual. Think of this when we read this play too. We have some longer scenes than previous. That shows their languorousness, their drawn out, their sleepy and casualness. He appears as a man facing a rapid, and this is talking about a scene that contrasts them. He appears as a man facing a rapid and cumulatively urgent succession of news from all over the empire. The wars of his wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius, their conjunct war against Caesar, the swift and victorious invasions of the Parthian Lebanese, Fulvia's death, the threats of Pompey, and the dangerously shifting sympathies of the Roman people. Caesar, in his turn, is presented on his first appearance in an exactly comparable way as a man habituated to an enormous and urgent sphere of action. Both these scenes are brilliantly effective in their conversion of necessary exposition to purely dramatic purposes. They move with an almost breathless speed and energy and establish Antony and Caesar as men of affairs at a very high level indeed. Right? So we're juxtaposing Antony and Octavius Caesar here, which Octavius Caesar, let me pull up Octavius Caesar is Octavius Caesar is what is he, the nephew, was named in Caesar's will. His maternal great uncle, his maternal great uncle was Julius Caesar, who was assassinated. So this is a descendant of Julius Caesar. This is Octavius Caesar here. That's who's fighting and vying with Antony in the play. A few more moments that I think are important pointing out, and then we'll jump into the synopsis of the play. All right. Think of the play also takes the role of game, and yet to this image of the game is to realize how much in the play it does not comprehend. Indeed, if the play presents a game of history and politics, it presents also something deeper and more important, a tragedy of human experience. When Antony finds himself at the very heart of loss, he is maddened at both the loss of the world and the loss of all trust in Cleopatra. But in losing both, he is also crying out at the loss of himself. It is not enough to say simply that Shakespeare is far more interested in the loser, Antony, than he is in the winner, Caesar, or even to say that his interest is with that relation between Antony and Cleopatra that caused the loss of the world. It is rather that the whole situation is presented so that the historical and political interest, the gain or loss of world power, becomes a part or facet of another and greater subject, the ruin of two people, and with them of the whole sphere of human experience. Any political history may have its human interests. Plutarch's life of Antony is vivid, shrewd, and alive in his portraiture, and Shakespeare is largely and unusually indebted to Plutarch's characterization of Antony. What differentiates the play Antony and Cleopatra is not merely a livelier or deeper characterization, but a transformation. Think of that theme, right? Transformation of all the action and event into a process of tragic and individual experience. And a little bit later, we get a note on tragedy. The tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra, then, is not simply their loss of the world, nor even their death, but the destruction of pride that accompanies both. All that makes them admirable is inextricably confused with its own corruptions. Their energy, vitality, and power are self-defeating. Antony is caught between the dual mutually destructive sources of his pride, power in Rome, and pleasure in Egypt. Cleopatra discovers or proves at Actium her full power over Antony, and in doing so loses both him and the world. Cleopatra fights to hold Antony, and Antony fights to hold the world, and in the process all Antony's courage reveals itself as inextricable from blind and irrational violence, and in his generosity from sensual obsession. All Cleopatra's vitality and self-possession reveals itself as wayward, demanding, and treacherous. But I think also it's much more than that. I think there are some deeper levels. A little bit later, we'll look at, we see they're concerned with dying out to the Roman death, right? The Roman death of suicide is what ends both of them. Um, Another important moment in the play presents something more leisurely, more spacious, and more impassive than some of our previous things. Instead of the cumulative intensity of the earlier tragedies, think of Macbeth, think of those scenes where we're like the really quick scenes at the end that leads up to the fight. This is more leisurely, more spacious. Its structure lies in the panoramic or kaleidoscopic display of diverse aspects of a world. We're in different parts. We're all over, right? Remember, in both Hamlet and Macbeth, we're kind of we're in those little areas. Um, at one moment, we watch a conference of world leaders attempting with some dignity and seriousness to come to terms with each other, an attempt that justifies Antony's earlier bitter self accusations. After the briefest of pauses, they are all celebrating in a farcical party that ends with a Bacchic version of Ring Around the Roses. Cleopatra speaks over the dead Antony, her exquisite lament for the loss of all that is valuable in the world. Shortly after, she is doing her best to cheat Caesar of her jewels. The whole play is constructed in this manner, out of pattern of juxtapositions and contrasts, with the point of view continually shifting and changing. That's what makes it hard to follow at times. The point of view is always shifting and changing. There's a lot of things going on. And the effect is something very different from tragic intensity, though full of complex and absorbing life. Uh, this complexity and absorbing life is most true of Cleopatra. She's described as a woman, and early on there are various descriptions of her, and we'll talk about Cleopatra. What is it about Cleopatra that draws Antony in? She is described as a woman of infinite variety, and I really think that shows through in this text. Um, Traditionally, Cleopatra is either labeled a femme fatale or described as the perfect and everlasting woman. I think those two are reductive. She's much more than that. Uh, Other critical interests shows biased readings based in patriarchal criticism that continue to distort the image of the queen. I think she's much more. She's a woman of infinite variety, and we see her in all her nature. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And quickly, I can ramble on and talk more and more about the play, but it's time to start reading. Here's the brief synopsis. You could look at it right here. Antony and Cleopatra tells the story of a romance between two powerful lovers, Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and Mark Antony, who rules the Roman Empire with Octavius Caesar and Lepidus. That's the triumvirate there. Although he is needed in Rome, Antony lingers in Egypt with Cleopatra. He finally returns to Rome when Pompey, another military leader, tries to gain control of the empire. Once in Rome, Antony marries Caesar's sister Octavia. So Fulvia dies. That's Antony's wife. He marries Octavia to form this political partnership, but he's still going back to Egypt and hanging and spending time with Cleopatra. After Pompey has defeated Caesar, imprisons Lepidus, and turns on Antony, Octavia attempts to reconcile them but fails. Antony returns to Cleopatra. He challenges Caesar at sea, adding Cleopatra's ships to his own. When she and her navy flee in mid-battle, Antony follows, abandoning his men. Antony fails in a second battle at sea. At first, he blames Cleopatra and plans to kill her. He responds to false news of her death, however, by attempting suicide. Fatally wounded, he reunites with her as she dies. Faced with Caesar's plans to humiliate her in Rome, Cleopatra kills herself with poisonous snakes. There's a brief synopsis. Here's the beginning of the play. At the play's opening, Antony, and we're going to jump into Act 1, Scene 1 soon in the next video. At the play's opening, Antony, who had abandoned his wife Fulvia and his post in time of war, is indulging in Alexandria's lavish lifestyle and is fully infatuated by Cleopatra. Then Antony learns from messengers that his wife and his brother Lucius were the cause of the unrest in Italy and had engaged in battle with Octavius Caesar. A new messenger brings the unfortunate news that Antony's wife, Fulvia, died in Greece, having fled Italy. Antony mourns Fulvia's death and resolves to leave Cleopatra and return to Rome in order to counter Pompey's threat in Asia. Cleopatra throws a passionate tantrum when she hears of Antony's announced departure. She rants and raves to Antony about love and devotion and accuses him of not loving her fully. But as quickly as the tides turn, Cleopatra begs his forgiveness for her outburst and wishes him victory. Antony departs for Rome, but Cleopatra knows he will return to her. This is the first few scenes. That's a brief, we're like 15 minutes, brief synopsis of the play. It's helpful to look at the characters here. We have characters. There's the triumvir, Lepidus, Octavius Caesar, Antony, Cleopatra. Enobarbus is Antony's faithful servant. But we're going to jump into the play. All right. Antony and Cleopatra coming up.